members, President Radcliffe, members of the board of South Dakota Farmers Union. It's a real pleasure and privilege to, again, attend your annual convention. This must be about the 12th, 11th or 12th year that I've had that privilege to meet with you. It looked like for a while today that poor old John wasn't going to quite get here. We spent 2 hours, about 16,000 feet up, circling around Rochester, Minnesota, because there was a little 3-mile square fog right square over the airport in St. Paul. And it took 2 more hours after we got there before the sun burned it off. Within 3 miles of the airport, it was just as clear and beautiful in that part of Minnesota as it is today in South Dakota. And why that fog was there and why it was so persistent, none of us know. In any event, the planes that were on the ground coming towards South Dakota weren't able to take off any more than the rest of us were able to land. So the plane waiting to come out here was still there when I finally got on the ground in St. Paul, and we arrived here only an hour late, and I'm sorry that your whole agenda this afternoon is set back some by this unavoidable delay. People in Farmers Union, people in South Dakota Farmers Union, have a deep and continuing conviction and regard for the family farm and the family ranch. This is the expression of faith and of a scientific knowledge of both how to organize society and do agricultural production that repeatedly has been proved in the history of the world as the outstanding and best production unit for farming. This is the true secret, if you please, in the Cold War that both Russia and China would give plenty for if they too could find the productive genius of the American family farm. It's the export that we hope, in addition to our wheat, that they will purchase or learn from us. Because in adopting the family farm, as have in America, we think this will lead to world peace. And if there's anything that's important to us that are here today and the children and their children around the country, it is the necessity in our time and all the rest of history to prevent war. Because war nowadays are not just a couple of knights with armor and white horses throwing swords or lances at each other. A total world war would now obliterate not only all of human life, but practically all vegetable and animal life on the face of the globe before we could get to shoot and stop. This you already know, and one of the major institutions that are important throughout the world in maintaining a peaceful world is prosperous, healthy, family farm pattern of agriculture. This is why the administration welcomed the opportunity to make the sale of wheat to Russia. That was the best lesson, the best education in what the family farm can mean in productive ability and productive genius, and therefore was one of the finest things in the interest of sanity in the world that the United States could have done. This notwithstanding some of the criticisms that were made of that wheat sale to Russia, which incidentally has now been fully paid for in gold. I had developed quite a long prepared the speech that I thought I would give you. If I had gotten here on time, I would have shared much of that with you. I think now, in the interest of the orderly conduct of your agenda, I will not try to follow the prepared script or to unload the whole load of hay.
John, we're short one speaker. Oldham isn't going to be here, so
Okay.
right on schedule. Give him a minute.
But I will just speak from the heart, as it were, with some of the major things, major ideas and thoughts I'd like to share with you. And in doing so, I want to talk mainly about where we are and what the future can be according to the decisions that may be made in the very near future. Decisions made by you and your fellow citizens around the country. Decisions of what kind of government do we want, and what is the relationship of rural Americans to their governments, local, state, and federal, particularly in terms of the aspirations of rural people. I'd like to mention things possibly in the order of 3 C's: the commodity programs, consumer and export programs, and community programs that are of importance to your income, to the attractiveness and prosperity of the communities that you live in, and indeed in terms of the American nation setting an example of what democracy can mean in the world in general. A study has just been completed and published by the Library of Congress that you should possibly write your senator or congressman and get a copy of your own. It's called Farm Program Benefits and Costs in Recent Years, prepared by the Legislative Reference Service of the Library of Congress. The major fact of importance shown by this study is that without the commodity programs, farm net income in the United States would be less than half of what it is now. It would be over $6 billion less in net income. If, in addition, the Food for Peace program and the expanded exports program were abolished, as some who advocate getting government out of agriculture would do, this would be an additional $2 billion off. To put it another way, for each $100 of net farm income, eliminating the commodity programs would cut out about 60 of that $100. It wouldn't be there. It's not in the marketplace. Cut out Food for Peace and expanded exports of wheat and feed grains and other commodities. This would cut possibly another $10 or $15 out of the 100, leaving somewhere between 35 and 40 out of $100 of 1964 farm net income. This would bankrupt between 1 and 2, immediately bankrupt between 1 and 2 of each 5 farmers in South Dakota. In the long run, it would result in some drop of $39 or more billion in the value of farmland in the United States, which over the past 4 years has been increasing $5 billion a year, which is deferred income for farm people. Farm income of American farmer is currently made up of about $5 billion that could be derived from the so-called free market. About $1 or $1.5 billion that could be derived, or that is derived, from food for peace and expanded exports, and about $6 billion a year from the commodity programs. This is the measure of what those who say they would abolish the commodity programs would do. I understand that there's a question whether some would abolish them immediately and go on from there, or whether this disaster would be brought on only in minor steps over the next 2.5 or 3 years. But regardless of which way, the end of that road is certain. Now, the programs that we have are a long ways from being what you want or what I want or what the President or the Secretary of Agriculture wants. They are the programs that came out of 3.5 years of hard trying after 8 years of effort, where the legislative situation, the political situation with respect to farm programs, and the economic situation that we had to start with about 3.5 years ago had completely disrupted and torn up the kind of programs that existed before 1952. Working back from behind the 8 ball, as it were, we have now been able to add about $12 billion in farm gross income, an average of about 900 million or $1 billion a year additional in farm net income nationally. This is far from perfect. This is far from where it ought to be. As a matter of fact, farm income ought to be up $5 billion instead of down 6 or 7, as it would be if we abolished the programs that we have. You might be interested to know that no better than the wheat program is for 1964, it is still so much better than no program at all that the fall sign-up for the wheat growers in the areas that grow winter wheat, who have now completed the sign-up, been a tremendous increase over the number of those who signed up for this year, signing up for the 1965 program. In fact, those that are already signed up in the winter wheat area already exceed the total sign-up between wheat and spring wheat plus winter wheat sign-up of this year's crop. This means that there has been a considerably broad acceptance of the wheat program by wheat growers. The 94% of wheat growers in Nebraska, 91% in Kansas signed up for the program. I only wish that high percentage of them Peckerwoods would have voted right in the wheat referendum when they had a chance, and we wouldn't be in this box that we're in now. 89% of the acreage allotment of all wheat growers in the winter wheat areas are signed up in the 1965 wheat program, which indicates that we are making the so-called voluntary wheat program operate to an advantage, even though it would not be as good as the program that you people voted for and by a wide margin in the referendum. Thought it might be interesting. You undoubtedly, it was in your papers, I expect, and you may have read it. I thought that since I had a copy, you might be interested in a few comments that President Johnson made down at Des Moines less than a week ago, which indicates the direction in which we are trying to move these commodity programs. He said in one paragraph, "This campaign is going to give the people of America a clear mandate for a farm policy that will restore full parity of income and opportunity for America's farmers." And I might say that his choice of the word income there, I presume, was deliberate. In any event, it is significant, because as he says later, what farmers are interested in is income and not necessarily some price ratio. That the thing that the family uses to buy family needs, that the family uses to buy production supplies, is income and not price ratios. And that our goal ought to be a full parity of income rather than a mere parity of prices. That if the most workable and the easiest to obtain through the political processes is a program similar to the Brannan Plan, with payments for acreage retirement, payments for the difference between a proper price and what the market price is. If these contribute to a parity of income, less attention needs to be worried about the ratio of prices paid and the prices received, because they are not a correct or true measure of the income situation. The President said we intend to continue and to improve commodity programs to strengthen farm income. We've got some pretty good programs on the books. They're not good enough. You know that even better than I do. We intend continuously and constantly to try to bring about improvements in those programs. The movement toward parity of income has been disappointingly slow. However, there has been a 5 percentage point, or almost a 10% shift in the right direction toward parity of income. Whereas in 1960, farmers were receiving only about 57% of parity, it's now up to about 63%. Now, this isn't anything near where it ought to be, obviously. But 63 is a whole lot better than 57, as long as we keep moving in the right direction. The President further said we intend to assure rural Americans full partnership in building of the great society. Now, just a word about exports and the Food for Peace program and its importance to South Dakota Farmers Union and some of your congressional friends at the time when I was still working with you even more closely than I do now. And Senator Humphrey of Minnesota and others are the people who developed the idea and popularized the idea of Food for Peace, the use of the abundant, efficient production of America's family farms to do things around the world that will contribute to peace. This approximates about $2 billion a year of exports, which, if we didn't have it as a market for farm commodities produced in the United States, would be a direct reduction in income. It would come off of gross farm income. It wouldn't affect the ever-increasing production costs. Therefore, every dollar of it would come off of farm net income as well as gross net income. This is the reason also why exports for dollars are so important. One out of every 4 acres of land farmed in the United States produces a commodity for export, either in the Food for Peace program or as dollar exports. It's obvious what would happen if we did not have those export markets. And we can't keep those export markets if we maintain high tariff barriers against the commodities that the people in those countries have to sell to us. We can't sell to these other countries unless we also buy from them. And in this field, as in so many others, the psychology of the situation is oftentimes as important as the real economics of it. And this is why it was so important that we take a statesmanlike and careful, sensitive attitude and response with respect to beef imports. This is why the voluntary agreements that we worked out with the other exporting countries were so much better and so much more important than a direct, unilateral action by our country alone saying, well, we're in a little bit of trouble, we're in bad trouble in beef, therefore we're just going to close our borders. Immediately our customers for wheat, feed grains, and particularly in the new common market in Europe, would have said, if that's the way you want to play baseball, we'll put ours up too. And where we would have blocked out maybe $800 or $900 million worth of beef, we would have blocked ourselves from $4 billion worth of sales of other commodities from the same farms that were producing beef. This is why the solution that Congress arrived at and the voluntary agreements that we made were a much better way of doing it than a absolute one-country action, which would have set up trade barriers and started possibly trade wars throughout the world against the commodities produced in the United States. Exports last year were at a record high. Exports in the last 4 years have increased every year. Dollar exports as well as Food for Peace exports. Dollar exports were at a record high. Many of these Food for Peace exports, as you well know, go for school lunch programs in other countries. Food for Peace exports build future markets for dollar exports. Promotional activities. The teaching of other people how to eat wheat as well as rice. Teaching other people how to make use of feed grains. The new export program for beef and beef calves to Europe. All of these have led to total exports last year being 20% higher than the year before and 35% above the level 4 years ago. The provision of food to the hungry in underdeveloped nations establishes the foundation from which those nations can launch on their own economic development programs. Many of you have participated in the Farmers Union contracts and programs in the other nations of the world, and you know that in Egypt, for example, the total income for a family, a farm family, for a whole year is equivalent of $50. This permits the purchase of clothing equal to about one cotton sheet, no shoes, no underclothing, very bare subsistence in the way of food, and mud huts for houses. Such people are not a market for anything much that we have to sell for dollars. But if they can double or triple even the low incomes that they have, they want good things the same as you and I do. And they'll buy them as they advance the economic development in their countries to where they can afford it. This has happened in post-war Japan, which is now the world's biggest customer for U.S. farm commodities, purchased and exports. As I'm kind of going down through the South Dakota Farmers Union program in a way, checking off the things that you for years said you wanted and they're now getting written into law. One of the things that you resolved for many years was a national food allotment stamp plan, so that the abundant production of U.S. family farms could be used to see that nobody in the United States went to bed hungry, that nobody suffered from malnutrition. As you may recall, the first executive order that President Kennedy promulgated after going to the White House was an order to the Secretary of Agriculture to set up a pilot food stamp plan and to expand to additional commodities and additional people the commodity distribution program. After 3 years of experience with the pilot food stamp plan and working with Congress in connection with it, Congress this year adopted a permanent nationwide food allotment stamp plan, which is one of the major elements of your program for years. It's now the law of the land. And the Congress later made a beginning appropriation to start expanding the food stamp plan into nationwide operation. The school lunch program continues to expand. Teaching children not only selling more farm commodities, but more importantly, providing a nutritional hot lunch for school kids that need it, which adds to their ability to learn, which is why they're going to school. And it's teaching them to better nutrition so that they'll have good eating habits all their life. These are important things that this food stamp program and the school lunch program are doing, and is carrying out your program in that connection. You have also said that you wanted additional and appropriate consideration given by the federal government in technical and financial assistance to farmers, their local organizations, and local units of government, provide credit, conservation, community facilities that we need for a prosperous and attractive rural America. This is underway. As a matter of fact, it's not an exaggeration, I think, to say that we are on the threshold of a rural renaissance. In spite of the income and commodity problems that seem to beset us, I think we're entering a new era of history. From promise of the Great Society. I think that's what the President meant when he said the sentence I read a moment ago. We intend to assure rural Americans full partnership in the building of the Great Society. And indeed, a rural renaissance can become the launching pad for the Great Society. If all of us, including the Congress, have the will, the foresight, and intelligence to figure out and to do all of the things that need doing. In rural America, through the Rural Areas Development Program and the community development approach, a very great deal is already underway. Exciting new job opportunities and improved living conditions are being created every day in rural America. They're being created by local people who, as they see the number of farm jobs in their area steadily dwindle, are moving to diversify their economies. They are actively seeking and getting new industry into their areas. They are building modern community facilities, improving their schools into modern institutions with well-rounded curriculum and teaching staff. They're training their people in new skills. They're developing their resources, putting those resources to work and finding new uses for excess cropland. One of the most exciting and still not brought off President Ratcliffe is one of the items that you've talked to me about several times that you're trying to do here in South Dakota. Somehow to marry up the interests and the desires of sportsmen and those of the farmers that own the land. The opportunity for additional farm income through various outdoor recreation enterprises like pheasant hunting, swimming, skating, skiing, hunting preserves, and all of the rest is an opportunity to have not a dwindling demand and market facing us, but to set up new kinds of farm enterprises that have a very rapidly expanding demand into the future. This is a new crop that nationally might well be rural America's #1 money earner in 20 years, according to the figures that Secretary Freeman has used on occasion. This is a provision of farmers of outdoor recreation for pay. This is a way that a sportsman accustomed always to a United States where they can hunt wherever the quail flew, as we say down home, are as interested as you are in conservation. They are beginning to understand that conservation of wildlife refuges, and conservation of land and water resources doesn't come for free. They realize that this means that federal and state appropriations must be provided for conservation and resource development on privately owned land, and they realize also if the hunting and fishing and trapping and recreation facilities, privileges and opportunities on privately owned rural land are to continue to be realized by a sportsman public, that there is a much better opportunity to continue this by developing some kind of cooperative arrangement with the landowners involved so that they can maintain and improve the resources that the sportsmen need. This is a real new opportunity for developing a new source of farm income as well. But fully as importantly, in national welfare terms, the need of increasingly urban population for outdoor recreation opportunities is one that is as equally important in the time ahead as meeting their food and fiber needs and their needs for shelter and wood products. In South Dakota alone, last year, (250) rural landowners and operators had established income-producing enterprises, new enterprises, on their farms. 9 of these had switched 4,200 acres from crop production to recreation as a primary source of income. And each acre that can be shifted from crops to recreation is an acre that you don't have to take out under the wheat program or the feed grains program. Altogether in the United States, there are 100,000 volunteer private citizens working in county, area, and state rural areas development committees in 2/3 of the nation's counties, working on projects that last year alone created 212,000 new non-farm jobs in their communities. And more rural people are finding that as we talk about new kinds and new enterprises for new and additional sources of farm income, the old tried and true cooperative is one of the best ways to do it. Just as you have demonstrated that large-scale cooperation in marketing of grain and buying petroleum products and other farm supplies, just as we have proved in the rural electric and rural telephone cooperatives. I think I'd like to quote a thing or two that I heard Senator Humphrey say the other day in Hot Springs, Arkansas, to 900 rural electric leaders. He warned that rural Americans should not take their rural electric cooperatives or rural electrification for granted. If they do, he said, a great network of rural electric cooperatives which the people have built can quickly collapse and disappear. What has been built to serve the people of rural America would serve instead the monopolist and the opportunist. Anyone who doubts that what rural electrification has helped you establish cannot be destroyed need only look at some of the voting records in Congress of some of the important people that you know. Some of the important people that are asking for promotion. To say that the rural electric program has completed its job, all of you know that this is hooey. But there are people that believe this when they hear other important people say it. Because not everyone, as you do, knows that the power load on rural lines is doubling every 7 years, that we must constantly improve the electric service, build bigger and better facilities, just as the profit corporations in the electric industry have to do. And it's well to remind ourselves that it wasn't so very long ago when there was not any rural electrification in Arkansas or South Dakota, because most of us had a choice. We could either do without electricity or pay $1,000 to $2,000 or more to get an extension, to pay for having an extension built in from our farm from a faraway transmission line. And then once we got that line built and it got the electricity, it would cost us 15 cents a kilowatt for the electricity we used from the line we'd had to build ourselves. Or we could continue to live in the dark, and that's what most of us in this room were raised on. As a result of the REA-financed electric systems, last year paid not 15 cents a kilowatt, but an average of 2 1/4 cents a kilowatt hour for the electricity that they used. This muscle power in the power marketplace, brought about through cooperation, not only benefited the cooperative members, it also served a new $1 billion a year national market for additional electric appliances and equipment, which sales have added rings to the cash registers on every main street in Arkansas and South Dakota. And the proposals that are now being made that the co-ops give up the territories that they have developed because they've now become heavy loads, and that cooperatives turn to the regular money markets instead of to the REA for source of credit. I made a calculation in the cost of electricity that this would result in South Dakota. The cost of 250 kilowatt hours of electricity on South Dakota rural electric lines would increase from the present $11.75 a month to $26 a month. Be the first and immediate effect. Let me say a word about soil and water conservation activities. You've always included this in your programs. One of the agencies that I work with, in addition to Farmers Home Administration, Rural Electrification Administration, Soil Conservation Service, the ACP program, Cropland Conversion Program, all of the conservation and development programs of the department. You may not be aware, one of the first 10 new resource conservation and development projects that are being developed under new legislation adopted by Congress just 2 years ago. One of the first 10 is in Bonhomie and Charles Mix counties here in South Dakota. Its objectives are land treatment, municipal water supply, sediment control, and outdoor recreation. The local sponsors are the Charles Mix, Emmanuel Chateau, Creek, and Scotland Soil and Water Conservation Districts. We're working with groups of farmers, and the Fort Randall Conservancy Sub-District is providing the land rights away and easements. County supervisors of the counties, county commissioners of the counties are cooperating, as are the county highway departments. In South Dakota, one small watershed project has been completed and 8 others have now been approved for operations. Nationally, I think you might be interested. In 1960, watershed protection, new starts on watershed protection projects in 1960 was 6 for the entire United States. In 1965, we made new starts on 5 times as many. We hope that this rate of acceleration will continue. In the field of credit, we have tripled the volume of credit made available through Farmers Home Administration in rural America. in 3 years with only an 8% increase in the number of federal employees required to advance and supervise that credit. I thought you might be interested in that because not only have old programs been revitalized. If you will recall, about 10 years ago, your national president, Jim Patton, set up a presidential commission on family farm credit. That committee worked up proposed, revised, and new legislation that it thought, later adopted by National Farmers Union Program Committee and Convention, as the kind of family farm credit legislation that was needed. In 1961, the administration recommended this to Congress, and it was adopted by the Congress as part of the Agriculture Act of 1961. These are things that have come about because there wasn't a great deal of controversy like there was over some of the commodity programs. You haven't seen much about them in the newspapers. But fundamentally, after income, credit to operate, credit to expand a farm or to buy a farm for a young couple is fully as important as the income necessary to repay the debt. And we're proud that we've expanded and developed a rural housing loan program, a rural housing loan program for senior citizens. This is something that Reuben Johnson for 10 years worked on, and during the 8 bad years, we kept the program alive. We even got congressional appropriations made for it, and then the executive branch wouldn't make the loans available to farmers when they did it. We now have 8 or 10 new loan programs, and I won't take the time to name all of them, but very significant are the loans to rural housing cooperatives for elder citizens. It's just getting underway. One such loan has been made in Minnesota to a group of senior citizens that formed a consumer cooperative to build housing for themselves. I understand there are applications underway in South Dakota. I think you are aware and favorably aware of the attitude of the executive branch and of the Congress with respect to cooperatives and new development in these years. I think a very large share of the credit for the kind of programs that have been adopted by the executive branch, a very large share of the credit for keeping those kinds of thoughts and concepts alive rest on the laurels, but to the credit of many senators and congressmen that kept those thoughts alive during the 50s, have done such strong work for them during the 60s. And just to mention 2 of those close to home, I know you already know the names, but preeminent in Food for Peace, and parity of income for farmers, and rural housing, Farmers Home Administration, agricultural conservation, and other programs have been what somebody laughingly said at one time, the 2 Democratic senators from South Dakota, Senator Humphrey and Senator McGovern. And I want to tell you that none of this could have come about, and progress in the future won't come about, except as you maintain a strong, fighting, family farmers, rural American organization that's fighting for these kind of things and have the kind of representatives that you have in Washington and President President Patton and Reuben Johnson and Angus MacDonald, who worked long hours very, very effectively to keep all of the items in your program before all of us and before the Congress all hours of the day. Sometimes we think they're a little mean and a little critical, but from your standpoint, this is good for them to be, because they're everlastingly and representing what you want in terms of family farm prosperity in a peaceful world. I appreciate your having waited so patiently for me to get here. It's a real opportunity again to be here, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you. Hello.
Real introduction for Senator McGovern, because he needs no introduction to this group. It's my privilege to present the Honorable George McGovern.
Secretary Baker, other officers, and members of the South Dakota Farmers Union. I think it's a great honor and a joy that I always look forward to participate in this state convention of the South Dakota Farmers Union. I've always thought that our state was a better place in which to live and to rear our families, and that the United States is a better country, a better nation, because of the contribution and the insights of the Farmers Union. I've had the privilege over the past few days of traveling in some 8 or 9 states in the closing days of the Congress and in the days since adjournment. And everywhere I've gone, I've come back with a new appreciation for rural America and for the farm families of our nation and the contribution they make to our overall strength. I've also come back with some new stories. One of the true stories that has come to my attention goes back some 8 or 9 years to a meeting in Minneapolis when Senator Humphrey was introducing former President Truman to a large Scandinavian audience. And they had been carrying on a kind of a good-natured banter all evening. Senator Humphrey said in introducing Mr. Truman, he said, Mr. President, one of the things we've always wondered about over here in Minnesota is why it is that Minnesota got all the Norwegians and Missouri got all the mules. And Mr. Truman thought about that for a moment, and he said, well, that's really very easy, Senator. Missouri had first choice. I take it that that's the Swedes that are applauding, but I don't tell that story in years when I'm running for election. If I didn't have about 4 years ago, I'd be a little bit careful about repeating it. But we do have not a humorous choice, but a very significant choice ahead of us in the few days that remain between now and this important presidential election that is fast drawing to a close. I want to say very briefly here this afternoon that I think the election boils down to one basic question, and that's the question of which man we believe is best qualified by judgment and by temperament and by experience to lead the United States here at home and to direct our foreign policy at a time when we're the #1 power in the world. I think in most campaigns, the differences between our major political parties have not been on the fundamental assumptions about American life. There are plenty of areas where we've differed with each other about how we implement those basic goals and assumptions about American life, but no serious party leader has really questioned for the last quarter of a century such fundamental programs as Social Security. No responsible national political leader of either party has seriously suggested that we do away with the entire system of rural electrification, or that we sell the Tennessee Valley Authority to private business, nor have there been statements from either political party, from the top leadership, that would completely upset the foreign policy that we have been following on a rather successful bipartisan basis since the end of World War II. But in 1964, we have two men, or perhaps I should say two forces, competing for the control of presidential power in this country, who are as far apart on the basic assumptions about the direction in which our country ought to move both at home and abroad as night and day. Mr. Goldwater captured the Republican nomination through the determination of a fanatical and well-organized and well-financed minority. And that minority does not really speak for the mainstream of either political party. It is not the voice of Abraham Lincoln or Theodore Roosevelt or George Norris or even of Rockefeller, Scranton, or Eisenhower. But it is a strange new voice that stands outside the main fold of both of our political parties and calls us to drastic and radical approaches to our domestic problems and to foreign policy that can only spell disaster should the day ever come when that philosophy would prevail. Mr. Goldwater told us that he wanted to offer the American people a choice in 1964, not an echo. And I think he's kept that promise. I think the choice is sharp and clear, that we have the clearest and most painful choice ahead of us that has ever been offered this country in any presidential year. It is the choice, on one hand, between a philosophy which holds that the government is our enemy, that Washington, D.C. is a monster that is out to destroy our liberties and take over the precious rights of the American people. It is a philosophy which holds that there is a war going on between our federal government in Washington and our state capital at Pierre. It is a philosophy which holds that the function of the next president of the United States and the next Congress ought to be one of restricting, cutting back, reducing, and backing up the government of the United States both at home and abroad. On the other hand, there is the choice of President Johnson, the view of President Johnson, that government is our friend, that the federal government in Washington is the government to which we swear our first allegiance. Now, that's always been the philosophy of both political parties. It was Abraham Lincoln who led this country in a great civil war 100 years ago to establish the principle of the supremacy of the federal government over the claim of any of the states, to establish the supremacy of the Union as the number one institution that all of us in this country want to preserve. And so that is the philosophy that is now offered by Lyndon Johnson, the philosophy which holds that our first loyalty is to our federal government, and that is through the partnership that we have, the states and local governments and citizens, with our representatives in Washington, with the great institutions of government that exist there, that we make progress as a free people. The choice is between a philosophy that has called for an end to all federal farm programs. That quotation and others like it have been repeated numerous times here today, but the philosophy is very clear in the words of Mr. Goldwater, that the answer to our farm difficulties is prompt and speedy termination of all federal farm programs. This is the man who has called for the liquidation of the rural electrification system and who has said that we ought to sell the Tennessee Valley Authority to private industry. I don't want anyone to take my interpretation of what he has to say. Let me just sketch in a few quick sentences from the Senator's public addresses of the past few months. He said some time ago, the time has come to dissolve the Rural Electrification Administration. It has electrified 98% of the farms already and fulfilled its original function. America, now it either should be dissolved or it should be revised. And then when he turned to the problems of agriculture, he said in Illinois the other day, what is wrong with letting the American farmer produce what he wants, when he wants, and where he wants, and taking his chances in the marketplace? Well, I think the answer to that question has come through very clearly in a study recently undertaken by the Library of Congress that bears out other studies that have been taken by the best agricultural experts in the country, which answers that question by saying that what would happen is a loss of about $6 billion annually in the net income of American farmers, that we could look forward to a decline of about 50% in the income of farm families all across this country. And so the choice, it seems to me, in agriculture is very clear. Now, I understand that on yesterday, my distinguished colleague, my senior colleague in the Senate, spoke to this same audience, and he had some harsh things to say about farm programs under the Kennedy-Johnson administration. And I want to say very frankly that no person who is concerned about American agriculture today is 100% satisfied with the condition in which we find ourselves in 1964. But when the senator deplores the fact that the farm parity level is now at 75%, he said 74, but it's actually gone up a point. But when he deplores the fact that it stands at 75% at the present time, I think he ought to take into consideration that if his man had had his way, and if the votes of Senator Goldwater had prevailed, and if the votes of Congressman Miller had prevailed, instead of 75% of parity, we would have had 50% of parity. Instead of over $12 billion of net farm income, we would have had somewhere around $6 or $7 billion. I think, too, we ought to take into consideration that the 75% of parity figure does not reflect another $1.5 billion that farm families have received in direct payments, in the diversion payments, in the wheat certificate payments, and in other direct dollar payments that have been made to farmers during this past year. So that when one looks at the 75% parity index, he must add on top of that another $1.5 billion in cash that has flowed into the pockets of farmers across this country that is not reflected in the parity figure. And that $1.5 billion would not have been possible had the votes, had the statements, and the philosophy of Senator Goldwater prevailed these past 4 years. Now, as I have said, I'm not satisfied with the condition of American agriculture today, but we have added $1 billion a year to the net income of farm families in this country as over against the last year of the previous administration. I wish it could have been $5 billion or $6 billion, but $1 billion above where we were in 1960 is moving in the direction that we want to go. And I'm also told that on yesterday, the administration was censured because of the beef import situation. I want to say just a word about that. This administration has moved very decisively to assist in the strengthening of beef prices these past few months. They've moved into a buying program of substantial proportions, a program that has had the effect of neutralizing much of the impact of whatever imports are still coming into the country. On top of that, legislation has been passed by the Congress, standby legislation which can be used to prevent any further or future buildup of beef imports. And through voluntary efforts on the part of our administration working with other countries, beef imports are down this year some 25% below the level of 1963. Now, to those who suggest that we ought to go further and throw up a tariff wall around this country, that would cut off all international trade. I can only say to those folks that we're now moving abroad to other countries something over $6 billion of agricultural commodities that we produce on the farms and ranches of this country. We're importing somewhere around $4 billion of commodities, largely tropical goods, coffee and spices and teas and cocoas and things of that kind that we do not produce here in the United States. But if we think in 1964 that we can build an isolationist wall around this country that cuts off all commerce, that cuts off all trade with other countries of the world, then I think we are expecting a blueprint for disaster that in the long run will cost us far more heavily than any temporary gain we might achieve. So let's not be misled about the import problem. Let's keep this thing in perspective. There are a good many people in our state who ought to know better, who've been suffering from a disease that I suppose we could call importitis, who have grossly exaggerated the impact of imports on the problems of our livestock producers. Now, no one underestimates the seriousness of the price decline that occurred particularly last year with reference to livestock prices, but probably not more than 10% of that problem could be attributed to the import situation, and that aspect of the problem has been fully offset by steps that have been taken by the administration and by the Congress during the past 6 or 8 months. So we do have a choice that ought not to be blurred, that ought not to be obscured by scare talk as to what has happened during the Kennedy-Johnson years. Now, above and beyond the agricultural issue to which I've referred, there is a choice that I think is of fundamental significance to every person that lives in this country, and that's the choice between a man who believes that it is weakness, that it is cowardice to work out a settlement short of war with our competitors on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and who regards the thawing of the Cold War as a disturbing sign, who opposed and voted against the nuclear test ban treaty, which has stopped the poisoning of the air that we breathe, and who wants to surrender the power of the presidency to military field commanders out in the field. This is the man who said, and I quote, "Someday I am convinced that there will either be a war or we'll be subjugated without war, real nuclear war, and I don't see how it can be avoided, perhaps 5 or 10 years from now." He said that on May 8th, 1961, which gives us about 2 years to go, according to those calculations. It was this same man who stood up on the floor of the United States Senate last year when we were debating the nuclear test ban treaty that I regard as the greatest single tribute to the late President Kennedy, and when he was reminded that some 91 countries around the world had moved quickly to ratify that treaty in order to protect the air that we breathe against deadly radioactive fallout, this is what he had to say on the floor of the Senate: "I don't give a tinker's damn what the rest of the world thinks about the United States as long as we keep strong militarily." Well, I want to say in comment on that attitude that the strength of the United States and our standing in the world and the hope for world peace depends on many, many things other than the size of our nuclear stockpile. Now, it's important that the United States keep militarily strong, but anyone who is familiar at all with the challenges that face this country of ours today knows that military strength in itself is not the answer to many of the problems that are ahead of us. It's not the answer to the problem of world hunger, which is perhaps the #1 challenge that faces us in the countries abroad. It's not the answer to the problem of disease and misery that afflicts so much of mankind. It's not the answer to the problems of unrest and lawlessness and racial injustice that exist
in our own country. And yet, at the very time that Mr. Goldwater talks about the United States seizing the initiative abroad, he would weaken us in all of these other areas. He would cut back our food-producing capacity. He would cut back on the health and the vigor of our economy here at home. He would reduce the amount of assistance, of public support for education and for health. He voted against the poverty program, which is designed to get at those roots of poverty that weaken us and restrict our strength here at home. And on the other hand, there is the choice of President Johnson, who came to the presidency at one of the most difficult and one of the saddest and most painful moments in our national history, and who has tried the very best he knew how, and with all the vigor and all the energy that he could muster, to keep this country moving ahead in the traditions set by the late President Kennedy. And I think that choice is very sharp and very clear. It is the nature of the choice that has prompted one distinguished Republican editor and journalist after another to come out calling for the defeat of Senator Goldwater and the election of President Johnson. Consider, for example, this brief statement from the Saturday Evening Post. A healthy, vigorous two-party system is absolutely indispensable to the survival of American democracy. Its proper functioning requires each of the major parties to put forth a man who is unmistakably qualified to be trusted with the grave and terrible powers of the presidency. In the presidential election of 1964, the two-party system has been seriously endangered. And I want to just digress from this editorial for a moment here to say that I don't welcome the destruction and the undercutting of the Republican Party. I think it's a party that has produced many great leaders in the past. I think we desperately need that party in our national life. I think we need the two-party system as it has served us down through the years. But listen now to this Republican editor. One of the great parties has fulfilled its duty by putting forth a man, Lyndon Johnson, who may have flaws and leaves much to be desired, but who is unquestionably as well qualified to be president as any tested leader the Democratic Party now affords. The other great party, the Republican, has shirked and betrayed its duty by putting forth a man who is manifestly unqualified to be president, and whose unsuitability for this responsibility becomes clearer with every passing day and with every feckless word he utters. And then let me just read the concluding line from this editorial, because it states the problem that's ahead of us in as sharp terms as I've seen it. A crushing defeat for Goldwater will drive the fanatical saboteurs of his party back into the woodwork whence they came. And then it will provide the opportunity for the party's true leaders to build anew from the wreckage that these heedless, ill-mannered, and arrogant men are sure to leave. Then the two-party system can be restored, and the voter will again have a choice, not a calamity. I don't know how anyone could state the issue in any more dramatic or moving terms than that. There comes to my mind in conclusion here tonight some of the experiences that I will remember as long as I live during those brief but I think inspiring days when John F. Kennedy led us as our president in the White House. I had the privilege during the inauguration of 1961 of sitting just a few feet from where the inauguration ceremonies were taking place, from where the president was to be sworn in. And I remember President Kennedy's arrangements to have Robert Frost, the New England poet, come to the rostrum and read some of his favorite poetry. And you'll recall that the old gentleman had some trouble with the sun, and it was shining in his eyes, and his eyes were not very good, and he couldn't see the original poem that he had written for that occasion. And so he turned to some of the poems that he had committed to memory, which he knew were favorites of President Kennedy. And one of the men's on those touching words, "The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." We know that John Kennedy does sleep now, but we also know that he kept the great promise that he made to the farmers of this country, to the small business people, the students, the housewives, and others across our country, that he would do everything in his power as president to place the authority and the influence and the power of our government on the side of the people, on the side of the national interest, toward the end that our country would truly move ahead to new frontiers. When he was cut down in his efforts to forward that task, the responsibility passed to President Johnson. It is now being carried partly by Senator Humphrey, our distinguished native son, and I think these are the men that offer us the greatest promise, the greatest hope for a strong and active agriculture and for a better society for all our people here at home in the kind of a world of peace and freedom that all of us pray for, that all of us want for our families and ourselves in the years ahead. It's toward that end that I want to join with you in our common effort in the years ahead. It's toward that end that I wish you Godspeed in the great work of the Farmers Union. Thank you very much.
Yesterday we heard from the manager of one of our regionals. Today we hear from the general manager of the sister regional, and together they create the real bulwark of the cooperative movement that we have in this Northwest and the cooperative movement that we're so proud of as Farmers Union people. A really dynamic leader, Tom Steichen.
Thank you, Ben. Farmers Union members, delegates, cooperators, and friends. It's indeed a pleasure to come to this meeting again, your 49th annual meeting. Been a little rough getting here today. Nice sunshine in South Dakota, but out in Minnesota there, things are a little foggy, I guess, because we didn't get off there, as Johnny Baker told you earlier. But we made it all right, and then, of course, on the meeting this afternoon, our good Senator McGovern is quite busy with what we're doing in this particular last 2-3 weeks, and had another meeting this afternoon, so he was on the program earlier and gave a real stirring message about some of the issues. As far as our giving a report on the operations of the Central Exchange, naturally we will give you some part of it, but we also wish to speak with you about some of the issues that are at hand. You've heard plenty of them today, and I think it's probably good to have different viewpoints about situations, and we'll cover a part of that. And above all, we'll talk about the Farmers Union in its educational work and what great success it has had. Mr. Radcliffe has introduced the directors of the Central Exchange from South Dakota that represent your cooperative organizations and you people among the 11 directors that are on that board. In order to carry out the objectives and the functions of the services that are rendered by the Central Exchange to the local cooperatives and on to you, it takes people to get the jobs done. And we're very pleased and very happy to have such excellent representatives in South Dakota. And on the stage behind me here are some of the employees that work for you in the state, particularly with the managers and the directors of the local companies. And I'd just like to introduce them first. Our good friend Boyd Myers, who's State Area Manager. Boyd, and time won't permit introducing all of the rest of the men. I'd like to have all the other field representatives stand so that you get kind of a look at some of the crew that's working for you. Boys, will you take a stand? When they get up like that, we start taking a look at them. Looks like the front line of a football team, don't it, huh? But that is what we call teamwork. The other half of the business operation that's carried on in your state are by the managers of your respective organizations, and they all have a keen interest in the development of Farmers Union and the work it's doing. And a number of them did arrange to come here this afternoon to be with you to participate in your meeting this Tuesday. And I'd like to have the managers that are down here from the various companies stand, please, or wherever they might be. Around here, some back here. Now that's the employees. Sometimes we have ex-employees too, and I just don't spot them, but I was visiting with one of the men that you've known for a long time, and if Gus Moseson, who used to be here for many years in the state of South Dakota working for the exchange, if he's here, would he stand? Gus? Right back here. You know, the work of the Farmers Union has been tremendous. While you're celebrating your 49th year, this isn't the beginning of Farmers Union. And it has tremendous responsibilities. Has had all of these years, actually this whole century of ours. But they are increasing challenges as we go along because of the changing times that exist. But I'm very confident that the Farmers Union, given the right programs and supported by the right thinking and the right people, will continue to meet these challenges and to carry on the very excellent work it has done in the past. In order to get this done, naturally you select a president who in turn hires some of the employees to carry on the function of the Farmers Union by states. And Ben Radcliffe has a good team, and I want to compliment Ben and all of his employees and all his field workers that carry on the very good work that is necessary to carry forward with Farmers Union philosophies and programs, and incidentally to do everything they can to carry on the philosophy of cooperative endeavor through business functions. Together as cooperatives, your Farmers Union, we have to continue this fight to build a successful farm program and a prosperous agriculture and cooperative organizations. And through these efforts, an ability to achieve these better life for farmers will not be what you call a rosy street to operate on. It won't be easy. It never has been easy. This past year certainly has been a difficult and trying one, both for farmers and cooperatives, and I might say particularly in my home state of South Dakota because of the conditions that existed in farming. However, as we look at it, it's not only one state, but many states that we have to view when you start comparing farm programs. The problems are complex, the problems are big. Our farmer cooperatives are confronted with a series of differing challenges as we go along, and contrary to what you may hear, there are no simple answers. If there were, you'd have discovered them long ago. Significant trends in agriculture affecting both your farms and your cooperatives are still taking place. The economics of agriculture have continued to change at frightening paces. The prospects, for instance, of losing our present farm population by half in the year 1970 is still with us. This fact is based on the most reliable and accurate government surveys, not just guesswork. This means a drop in your farm population of over 800,000 per year in the United States. We will probably have 2.5 million farms about 6 years from now, if these sources that we get the information from are reliable, and part of them come from the Kiplinger letter themselves, which is one of the best sounding boards. This past year, of course, they register, there's about 3.5 million farmers, so as we say here, about a 6-year period, there might be a fallout or a dropout of almost another one. The experts, I say the experts are predicting this to happen regardless of any programs that are designed or that you can see on the horizon. And this is a place where the Farmers Union fits into the picture most dramatically to try to change some of these things that are going on. Sure, we have the rural areas development and other significant programs, but no matter how successful they are, they will do nothing but slow down the process to soften the adjustment. However, it is quite likely that in the future our farms and our rural communities can look forward to new life, vigor, and prosperity if, and it's a big if, they are given a chance to succeed. Fewer, larger, and richer is the phrase that has often been used to describe the farmer of the future. I think it also describes the cooperatives of the future too. Fortunately, all the facts show that while there are fewer of them, the family-owned and operated farm has not only held its own, but has increased in percentage of all farm operations in the last 10 years. The future for farmer cooperatives, while not easy, has a tremendous challenge and potential growth, along with the family farmer, if, and I stress this again, if given a fair chance. The future prosperity of our rural communities also is almost wholly dependent on the prosperity of our farms. According to the recent issue of the U.S. News and World Report, over 98%, I'll repeat, over 98% of the $41 billion that farmers spend was spent in cities of less than 30,000 population, and the largest share of this was spent in towns of less than 5,000. This is a fact that more people in South Dakota ought to appreciate, and particularly the businessman. What affects farmers also affects your rural schools, your churches, and your towns and all else, including your cooperatives. This is why we are genuinely concerned. I know this is not news to you. We in the Farmers Union have recognized this for a long time. Fortunately, I believe some others have too. For instance, the Independent Bankers Association says in a recent publication, and I quote, that the low farm income is the economic villain, and that agriculture is sick right now, and low farm income is the root of our problem of unemployment, idle industrial capacity, low corporate profits, and high taxes. The bankers say that the big city people are more closely tied in with farm economy than many of them realize. They say, and I still quote, nationally, agriculture and business related to agriculture account for approximately 50% of the total production of goods and services. Thus, our farms are the beginning point of our country's wealth. As sort of a side from this, just last Wednesday, less than a week ago, I heard a candidate in Minnesota running for the senatorship of that state speak to a group of businessmen in South St. Paul state that the basis of the economy of the upper Midwest states, not only Minnesota, but all states, is dependent upon agriculture. Now, he came from a different side of the fence than my thinking is, but it was rather interesting that he will not come out publicly and make this kind of a statement in view of some of the other stands that have been taken by people of his own party. But he was on a question period, and it was rather interesting to nail this gentleman down to answer the various things that he had made in his talk and what he would do if he had the opportunity or the chance to do something if he was a congressman or a senator. Rather interesting. He had no answer to it. But the fact is that most people recognize, when you nail them in a corner, that the dependency of the towns in our upper Midwest countries are dependent upon agriculture, if not throughout the whole United States. They ought to speak about it at the time when it counts, is where I get a little hot about it. Here again, it would appear that our small towns across the Midwest can share in the coming prosperity in agriculture if given a fair chance to survive. Now here is where the big if comes in. The promise of the Great Society lies before us. You've heard much of it yesterday. You've heard some of it again today. Again, it's repetitious in part, but let's get a different, maybe a viewpoint on it. Surely the past 4 years have been among the most challenging in our history. Some great legislative, social, and economic battles have been fought. We have not won all of them. We have lost some on occasions, such as the wheat referendum. However, let us not discount the gains. The tremendous progress has been made, and against nearly impossible odds at times. For instance, it is all too easy to forget that gross farm income is $4 billion a year greater than it was 4 years ago. Mr. McGovern had indicated it was $1 billion. The information I have here is $4 billion. Gross income, I mind you, not net income. Let us remember that income per farm, while still not satisfactory, is at its highest level. Let's remember that prices have been maintained or raised on most commodities, and that surpluses are down, and that cash sales of farm products in foreign countries are at an all-time high. In addition, more food has been distributed through the Food for Peace program, voluntary agencies, and our school lunch programs, and now the accepted food stamp plan. We must not forget that these were hard-won victories. These are all documented facts. Incidentally, I highly recommend that you get a copy of your own Senator McGovern's remarks in the Senate of September 16th. It's printed in the Congressional Record. He was too modest when he was up here just a few moments ago to make a comment about it. But I urge you to get a copy of this because I believe it to be one of the most revealing, most thoughtful, most considered approach to what's happening in farm income and so on. So if you want to get a copy of it, it's the Washington, from Washington, it's a Congressional Record of September 16th. All you have to do is to write for it. It's too long to read to you. It's all of this, the whole material here. But it is a real study on the problem of agriculture and one of the best. Then too, the public image. The public image. All of us are so keen to having that public image just right, you know. Of agriculture has been changed. It's not what happened a few years ago. You could go back 4 years and I'm sure that there was quite a cloud upon farm vocations. In 1960, I'm sure that the average person actually believed that farmers were pampered, greedy, subsidized producers of those horrible surplus that cost the taxpayers so much money. This was the image of agriculture 4 years ago. Today it's different. During these 4 years, Secretary Freeman has made literally thousands of speeches to all kinds of audiences, telling them about the miracle of modern farm production. He has told your story of farm efficiency and abundance that makes America the great nation that it is. He has used his powers of offices to let the world know that the American farmer is feeding his countrymen with better and more food at less cost than ever before in history, using food to build prosperity and abundance abroad, while in addition feeding millions of hungry mouths overseas. Secretary Freeman is the best public relations man the American farmers ever had. And he hasn't neglected the farm cooperatives either. He has more than matched his good words with good deeds to help farmers strengthen and preserve their marketing, supply, and service cooperative. He has instituted new policies, plans, and programs to help cooperatives of all kinds. He reinstated the USDA's policy in the support of cooperatives. He has given Assistant Secretary John Baker the green light, so to speak, to create new services and programs to strengthen cooperatives. And Johnny told you the story this afternoon of many of the things that are in the making, that are being done, and things that can be accomplished with the proper support. And just this summer, in the face of stiff opposition from the feed industry, Secretary Freeman reinstated the intention of the Department of Agriculture to help farmers through their cooperative supply and marketing organizations. And I would imagine Mr. Thatcher may have commented on that last night, because this is in an area where the GTA does its services for the farm people. In addition, as evidence of the intent to support cooperatives, Secretary Freeman called on his staff and the Co-op Advisory Council, of which Johnny Baker heads, by the way, to launch a great 18-day Co-op Month celebration in the Department of Agriculture. The observance is designed to show how the Department of Agriculture programs assist rural people to build stronger co-ops and thus improve the rural economy. In all the records of the past 4 years, with its tremendous numbers of new policies and programs to aid farmers, cooperatives, rural communities, and the whole nation has been tremendously impressive. This forward-looking activity is probably unmatched in modern history. This administration has an opportunity to continue to improve